Well, ladies and gentlemen, a scandal is breaking out in the European Union again, but this time the situation is really critical. Hungary, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, with whom Brussels cannot even physically get along, has decided to veto the extension of sanctions against Russia. Yes, the very sanctions that European bureaucrats update every time with the certainty that another tightening is about to destroy the Russian economy. However, so far such results have been observed rather in Europe itself, but somehow it is not customary to talk about this. The sanctions expired on January 31st, and this became a kind of wake-up call, because there will be no extension without a unanimous decision of all 27 member countries of the bloc. But Hungary, a small but extremely stubborn country, suddenly became indignant and refused to sign this collective ritual of Western countries. The time has come to throw sanctions out the window, and Orban, clearly enjoying the moment, has put European politicians at a dead end. It is still unclear what to do. Some diplomats have already admitted that if an agreement does not work out, the European Union will face a legal conflict from the 1st of February. The business community is confused because formally the ban on working with Russia may disappear, and companies will be faced with a choice. Either resume trade with Russia or wait for new bureaucratic instructions from Brussels. Friends, these and other news from this video are worth your attention. So let's not delay. Let's get started. According to leading analysts, Orban's move not only irritates Brussels officials, but also undermines the very concept of the EU's sanctions policy. Hungary has repeatedly stated that sanctions are doing more harm to Europe than to Russia. According to the European Economic Center, since the sanctions were imposed, the EU economy has lost more than 1.5 trillion euros, while Russia has managed to adapt, establish trade with Asia, and minimize the damage. Hungary was simply the first to decide to tell the truth. The sanctions policy has failed, said French economist Jean-Michel Lambert. The issue is really complicated because even if the sanctions are legally terminated, it is unclear how the business will behave. Some companies may take this as a signal to resume trade with Russia, while others will expect a political solution. In Germany, there are voices of representatives of the industrial sector who claim that the continuation of sanctions will primarily hit the Europeans themselves. Wolfgang Hellmann, president of the Association of German Machine Builders, said that the German economy is already suffering from the energy crisis, the loss of the Russian market, and rising inflation. A further escalation of sanctions could lead to the collapse of many businesses. What prompted Viktor Orban to take such a radical step?
Brussels is strangling Hungary financially.
For several years, the European Union has been freezing the financing intended for Budapest under the pretext of non-compliance with democratic standards. According to the official version, Orban does not sufficiently respect European values such as judicial independence and minority rights. However, the real reason is obvious. Brussels simply cannot tolerate that the Hungarian Prime Minister has long refused to support sanctions unconditionally and is actively trying to block military aid to a well-known country, openly declaring that this conflict is not Hungary's business. Moreover, he proposed an alternative model, to negotiate with Russia directly rather than through Brussels intermediaries. It's time to admit that the policy of isolating Russia has not worked. The EU has lost the economic war, said Hungarian political analyst Thomas Moner. Orban's policies annoy Europe because Hungary is constantly going against the mainstream. Orban regularly travels to Moscow without EU sanctions, develops a dialogue with Russia, and promotes an alternative point of view on the conflict in Eastern Europe. And now he is also trying to unite the far-right forces in Europe. The change of power in the United States is also an important factor. On the very first day after taking office, Donald Trump began to destroy everything that Brussels had been building for so long. He abandoned the Green Agenda, promised to accelerate inclusive reforms, and questioned assistance to Ukraine. Orban saw this as an opportunity and decided to act, realizing that now was the best time to attack the Brussels bureaucrats. He is supported by other politicians in Europe. French MEP Gilly Brun said Orban was the first to challenge the Brussels dictatorship, and others may follow. Against the background of all these events, the Kremlin has already stated that negotiations with Brussels, Paris, or Berlin should not be counted on, since Europe is not independent today. However, The Hungarian Prime Minister clearly expects that his démarche will help make the European Union more accommodating in the upcoming negotiations. Moreover, there are already rumors in Washington about the preparation of some kind of deal on the conflict. The media reports that the lifting of some sanctions against Russia may be one of the key conditions for concluding this deal. And in this context, Orbán's actions look like an early preparation of the ground. So here we have a classic political gambit. Orbán goes all in, knowing full well that Brussels cannot afford serious retaliatory measures against Hungary right now. Trump is taking steps that completely contrast with the EU's agenda, Russia is biding its time, and the European Union is frantically looking for ways to get out of a situation in which one obstinate Hungarian is destroying the entire strategy of the collective West. Anyway, if the sanctions really don't last, it will be the biggest diplomatic failure of the European Union. Viktor Orbán seems to have decided to finally take Hungary out of Brussels' control and, perhaps, pave the way for more decisive steps with his rebellion. As the story of Orbán shows, such tricks don't just happen. The show is just beginning. Meanwhile, friends, Viktor Orbán has finally stopped balancing the pressure of the European Union and Hungary's national interests. Now he is openly challenging the elites running Europe. In his last speech, Orbán stated that he intends to veto any decisions that push EU member states onto a path that makes Europe dependent on global financial institutions. In fact, this is the first time Orbán has made it clear so directly that the confrontation with Brussels is reaching a new level. Now it's not just a disagreement between Hungary and the European Union over migration, national sovereignty, or anti-Russian sanctions. This is a struggle for the future of Europe. Orbán gathers around him those who share his views. Conservative forces, dissatisfied with the course of the European establishment, support Viktor Orbán. And the most interesting thing is that he clearly feels support from outside, primarily from the United States, where the arrival of Donald Trump and the growing influence of Elon Musk in European politics create favorable conditions for him. The Hungarian Prime Minister has repeatedly stated that the current course of the EU is leading the continent to decline. In a recent interview with Kossuth radio station, Orbán bluntly said, "The European Union should be a union of free nations, not a tool for spreading globalist ideology. We will not allow Brussels to decide what economic, migration, and social policies Hungary should pursue." He also added that many European countries have already realized the harmfulness of the agenda imposed by Brussels, but they are afraid to openly speak out against the EU due to threats of sanctions and economic pressure. These statements by Orbán did not go unnoticed in the European press. French political scientist Pierre-Antoine Delofos believes that the Hungarian leader seeks to form an alternative European Union based on the principles of national sovereignty and conservative values. If Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister, manages to win over major European countries such as Italy, Germany, and France, it could trigger the largest political crisis in the history of the European Union. Analyst Lofos predicts such a scenario, emphasizing that Orbán's boldness has recently been linked to the emergence of powerful allies. One of the key factors that strengthened the position of the Hungarian leader was the active intervention of Elon Musk in European politics. In recent months, Musk, the owner of the X platform, formerly Twitter, has shown sympathy for right-wing conservative forces in Europe. His support is expressed in the promotion of content critical of the current EU policy. A real political earthquake was Musk's interview with Alice Weidel, the leader of the Alternative for Germany party, which the German authorities are trying to marginalize. During the conversation, Weidel said that Germany is on the verge of disaster due to sanctions against Russia, the closure of nuclear power plants, and uncontrolled migration. She also called for the normalization of relations with Moscow and the resumption of gas supplies via the Nord Stream. The fact that Musk provided a platform to the leader of the AfD caused a sharp reaction in Berlin. Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck accused the billionaire of undermining democracy, and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock did not rule out sanctions against his companies. The German edition of Der Spiegel published an article titled, "Elon Musk Wants to Reformat Europe," which explicitly states that the entrepreneur supports far-right movements. Germany is not the only country where Musk is showing interest in right-wing politicians. In the UK, he sympathizes with Nigel Farage, the leader of the Brexit movement, who criticizes London's migration policy. In Italy, George Meloni attracts Musk's attention, and in France, Marine Le Pen, whose National Unification Party has become the main opposition to President Macron. Viktor Orban, using this wave, intensified diplomatic efforts. He held talks with Marine Le Pen, discussing migration and European integration, Geert Wilders, leader of the Dutch Freedom Party, and representatives of the Italian Brothers of Italy Party. At a conference in Budapest, Orban announced his intention to create a conservative international. We must unite to fight Brussels and the globalists. Europe must return to its roots, culture, and traditions. Expert Christophe Bonnet from the French Institute of Geopolitics notes that previously Orban was isolated, but now his alliance with the right forces could become a serious challenge for the EU. The European bureaucracy is preparing for a counterattack. The European Parliament is discussing sanctions against Hungary, including the freezing of funds and even the deprivation of voting rights in the EU Council. Guy Verhofstadt, a supporter of European integration, said that Orban is leading the country to leave the EU, and his coalition is capable of destroying the Union. Anti-Russian sanctions and the energy crisis have hit the EU economy, increasing citizens' discontent. Protests are growing in France, Germany, and Italy, and right-wing parties are gaining strength. For example, in Austria, the Freedom Party criticizes the EU's migration policy, and 55% of Austrians support stricter controls on migration. In Germany, 1 in 4 young voters sympathizes with the right. Experts point out that the EU is on the verge of transformation. Right-wing forces, previously marginalized, now influence politics, and their success depends on their ability to offer an alternative to globalism. Hungary, backed by Russia and China, has become a symbol of resistance. 60% of its citizens approve of Orban's policy of sovereignty. Europe is going through an era of turbulence. The crisis can lead either to the disintegration of the EU or to its reform, where national interests and conservative values will take center stage. As political scientist Harold Schumpeter notes, the EU will either adapt or become a historical monument. The struggle for the future of the continent has entered a crucial phase, and its outcome will determine whether Europe will remain united or disintegrate into new political realities. Friends, now I want to express my opinion. What a twist! The whole situation with Orban and the EU is simply blowing up consciousness. Can you imagine how difficult and multifaceted a political game can be? Orban is literally challenging the entire political system of Europe and Brussels, and his steps seem to be no longer just a game at the national level, but an attempt to wrest Hungary from the clutches of the EU. But if the sanctions are not extended, what does this mean for the whole of Europe? Maybe Brussels has actually lost the economic war with Russia, as analysts claim? And more importantly, how will this turn out for ordinary citizens? Business is already in disarray, but what if an economic collapse awaits us all, and someone in Brussels understands all this perfectly well, but pretends that everything is under control? These are the questions in my head. But it's not that simple. It is important to understand that Orban is now not just a loner who goes against the whole system. He finds support among the right-wing forces of Europe and, it seems, is beginning to assemble a real coalition to fight the globalist ambitions of Brussels. There are not only economic issues here, but also, in fact, questions about what Europe should look like in the future. Will we return to the old borders of sovereignty? Or will we continue to live in a world where decisions are imposed from above? As for those who support Orban and his course, they are clearly betting on sovereignty and independence from global players. Do you believe in a model of Europe's future where everyone stands up for themselves and their interests? I honestly doubt that this will work in the long run. But anyway, this is not just a political game, it is a struggle for the future, for influence on the continent. And only time will tell who will win this game. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and if you're interested in what's next, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there's still a lot of interesting things ahead.